Do you think that the Confucian ethic has any impact on the education system here? Because there's a tension between the traditional Western system and, say, the traditional East Asian model of education. What do you say about this tiger mum concept?
There was a book written by a psychologist, well, really a political scientist turned psychologist named James Flynn. He's an American living in New Zealand. He's popular for what's called Flynn effect, about the growth of IQ across cohorts. But he wrote a book, I don't know if you ever read the book, called Success of Asian American Children.
No, I haven't.
No, it's actually very interesting. And he was asking the question, this was 20 years ago he wrote the book. And at the time, there was a notion that East Asians were much smarter. The IQs of East Asians were 10 to 15 points higher in terms of measured IQ than say, normal American populations, and that there would be this natural superiority of the East Asian. Then he looked at more closely. Now these were East Asians in exactly the setting that Steve was talking about, you know, places like Berkeley, UCLA, and other schools as well. And he looked at more closely at this, and he noticed that very little of it had to do with raw IQ. It had to do with this self-discipline and the fact they were doing homework, and the parents were interacting with the kids, and that there was this, what we would call non-cognitive skills, personality traits that were actually fostered by the family environment. And the structure of this finding was really quite remarkable, and that feeds in very well with the work of another one of our networks. And so the tiger mom is integral to that, in the sense of the mother encouraging the child to succeed. And I wouldn't say it's just East Asians either.
No, the South Asians.
South Asians very successful, and again, equally successful. I'm not sure, I've never seen a ranking.
Yeah, I've never seen an argument
but
that
it's very,
South Asians are doing any less well.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, they're doing extremely well. But other groups as well. I mean, traditionally, there's stories of Jewish groups encouraging children. There's also studies of African American groups, and as opposed to, say, Jamaican American groups. I actually shouldn't make that distinction. The Jamaican origin African Americans living in the U.S., as opposed to the American born, say, 2 or 3 generation students, where the family structure seems to be different and the encouragement structure is different. So it's been documented by people like Annette LaRue and others that there's a different family structure which discourages certain aspects of child creativity and curiosity. Just says no. They start hitting the kid if they are discouraged. There's more negatives than positives, whereas the image of the image that I always like is this one of Woody Allen, one of the Woody Allen movies, I've forgotten which one, where his parents are cheering him on. They're toilet training him. It's something like this. But both parents are sitting there watching him earnestly, and it's just, you want the kid to succeed. That might lead to neuroses in later life.
He's probably telling his analyst about it.
No, but on the other hand, if you had parents that weren't at all concerned, or there are some indigenous populations in the U.S. where literally the tradition of child rearing is different. You leave them alone. You don't encourage them. And there do seem to be real consequences of those cultural patterns. So in that sense, the patterns are interesting. But then the question is, how do the patterns themselves change? So there are these studies, right, in the 2nd and 3rd generation. Are they breaking down? We saw this in Puerto Ricans coming to the U.S., right? First, Marta Tienda, one of my colleagues who used to be at Chicago, now she's gone to Princeton. She looked at the study of the immigration of Puerto Ricans. The first generation of Puerto Ricans had a very separate identity. Even though they were African American, they didn't identify with someone. And by the 2nd and 3rd generation, race started trumping culture, and they started performing more or less at the same level, which wasn't a very high level. So these cultural factors, even the mother's role, the social expectations, play a very important role. We don't understand it. We actually we're starting to understand it, and that's one of the goals. So it sounds really soft and fuzzy to talk about these cultural things, but I don't think it's trivial. I don't think it's...
I mean, the fact mathematics can't capture now and possibly ever doesn't make it less empirically salient.
No, I mean, there are some important, but the question is, what can we extract from the tiger mom? So one of my colleagues at Chicago, you've heard Grace's distinction?
She's self-defined as one. So.
Well, Grace Chang is a Chinese American at the University of Chicago. Her father actually was very influential in designing the Taiwan reforms that led to the Taiwan economic miracle in the 1950s. But she makes a great distinction between the authoritative mother and the authoritarian mother. And I think that's the distinction that is important in the Tiger Mom. It's not a question of some controlling person who's telling you what to do. It's somebody who's informed and nourishes the child. And I really don't know. Freud probably has quite a bit to say about this. No, but I mean, if the mother's too overbearing or somehow, and it's not something that we know yet fully, just exactly how you, and I think it's individual. It has to be sort of individually based, but we do know these factors matter. And as he was saying, the California system, it's not also the Vietnamese Chinese, right? Very successful yes. in the California school system. So it's not just Chinese origin populations. Well, they're Chinese, but they've been generations in Vietnam. They came as immigrants. They came as refugees. They were desperately poor in the 1970s, and now they're leaders. I mean, many of them are leaders. There are also gangs in Irvine, right? So,
yeah,
so it's not like it's all uniform story of happiness, but amazingly successful given what looked like destitution. So we have lots of immigrant groups, and then the other groups in the U.S., like the Italians and the Poles and others, they're kind of in between, right, in terms of success stories. And I don't know if anybody's really studied the parenting traits of these different groups.
I'm certainly not aware that that's been done.
Yeah,
and
but we don't know everything, obviously.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. But this is, again, part of why as social scientists the China venue is so valuable. It's because of the differences between the United States and other countries that have been studied, that they can push these transnational questions almost.
Well,
and
certainly, sorry, carry on.
I mean, just, and then of course, then I'll say the underlying question is, how do these evolve? What were the mechanisms that generated different parenting styles across both socioeconomic classes as well as ethnicities within the United States? I mean, obviously, when we talk about the differences in parenting styles, it's not a judgment about the care that a parent feels, but and that's important to put on the table, not for political correctness, but to recognize that this is where policy interventions can matter. And so when Jim has referred to these successful interventions on non-cognitive skills, they didn't just have a component of enriching the child in isolation. They also had to do with almost, I guess, teaching parenting skills, for lack of a better phrase, and so they shouldn't be regarded as, by any means, fixed.